So, John Waters, the man, the myth, the legend. John, I'm going to hand this over to you, your capable stewardship. Off you go.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Derek. Just strikes me that, the kind of format we're having here tonight is, and it is on a Saturday, is very similar to the format they used to have at the end of the Late Late Show way back in the day, where you had a panel of people, and one would come on one by one and have their piece, and then they would all get involved in a ding-dong at the end. And that's not a bad precedent, considering that we don't have any fourth estate in the country anymore, we don't have any gay burn, we don't have any discussion, we don't have any conversation. The subject of this might seem, all the subjects of this conversation we're having tonight might seem, in a certain sense, inappropriate for a night like this and a mood like this. But I don't think so. I think it's very important that while we celebrate and we are happy and we're joyous, that we remember and remind ourselves of what's real in our country and what's real in the world. Because there's a kind of a demon that is taking over our country, which is probably the hardest, the most, I suppose, the most intractable obstacle that we face in the context of trying to explain to people what's happening and how serious it is. And I call that normalization. That despite all the things that we know and all the things that we have dealt with for many years now, most people are still unaware. And the whole purpose of the media, or primary purpose of the media, is to host a conversation which it's not so much that it leaves those things out. It actually implies with every word that these things are nothing. They don't exist. They're conspiracy theories. They're inventions. Only crazy people think these things. And this is the way it's done. That if you can do this in a society, if you can control the media totally, and they can, through purchase, you can actually close down thoughts, and you can close down people, and you can bring about results that, for example, when somebody, even when somebody is telling the truth, the raw truth, totally, they can be treated as if they're insane. And that's the project of our media now. Certainly one of them. They have others. Demonizing people, of course, is a very important aspect as well of their work. Lying morning till night, of course. But this creation of what I call the pseudo-reality, the false reality, which in a certain sense brings us back maybe 20 years, in a certain sense. And the discussions that happen are about things that happened then, or similar things to what happened then. In a certain sense, the presidential election is an example of this. And it's very strange. I mean, there was a certain sense of a victory for us in the outcome of the Spoil the Vote campaign. But when you drill right into it and consider that the crimes that have been committed in the last nearly 6 years by our government, the homicide that they have been committing against their own people, fiddling or rigging a presidential election is not all that serious by comparison. We need to keep focus on that. That's partly why I think this is so important, what we're going to do here tonight, to talk about real things. Not that the presidential election isn't real. Of course, it was profoundly crooked. The good news is Christian Morris is now taking an action in the High Court against this, and I think he has a very good chance of getting a result, notwithstanding that 98% of the judiciary is completely rotten. He might get lucky and get a good judge. If we get a good judge in that case, Christian will win, because the argument has not yet been made. So normalization, pseudo-reality, these are our enemies. most of all, at this stage in where we are. Because our task every day is to try to find ways of making one other person a little bit more aware than they were before they met us. All of us, not just me and Patrick and people like that. So Patrick E. Walsh, has been doing this for 6 years now, nearly, from virtually the very start. Once the vaccines were so-called, the pseudo-vaccines, the death jabs, once they were launched, very shortly afterwards, Patrick began to do his work. He's an accountant from Kilkenny. He's also, I think, now, one of our greatest journalists by default. He came in the back door and he cleared the room because nobody else was doing this job in this particular arena. And for 5 years now, he's been assiduously documenting one of the central issues that we face in our society, which boggles the mind when you stand back from it and think, not alone is this happening, but this is being not just ignored, but buried. It's being dismissed. And that's what we want to talk about, because this is like fiendish in its implications for society. Because you see, even us in this room, this idea of the normalization and the pseudo-reality, it affects us too. It affects me. I know all this stuff, and yet I'm happy today. I don't think I should be happy. People are being killed in my country who could live great lives every day, virtually. This is what Patrick has told us. And I believe him. I've seen the figures. I've been watching and trying to write about this from the very start, since Patrick started to do this job, this extraordinary job, back in 2021. So, Patrick, how did you first become aware that there was an issue? Where did you pick that up from?
John, I picked it up from RIP.ie is what started me on this. We all know what RIP.ie is. It's a funeral notice website, and 98% of death notices end up on RIP.ie of deaths. And it was in 2021, 2022, I had an email set up for Kilkenny. Like good Irish people, you don't want to miss a funeral. And the email was coming through, a lot more common. And that just set me thinking, there's something going on here. I was aware of other people saying, like, I didn't fall for the pandemic. I didn't believe it from the start. But that's a different thing than believing that people were dying of something else from 2021 onwards. Now, I started first to see, could I count the deaths for Ireland, and I just couldn't do it. I hadn't the tech skills to scrape the site. So I decided I fixed on Kilkenny. And I did it for, I think, 6 months, first of all, in 2022. And I submitted to all my local newspapers and radio stations, and totally blanked me, except for one person picked it up. Jimmy Rattigan he was a retired journalist, and he had an online site, and he rang me straight away. And I hadn't sent it to him. Don't ask me how he got it. And he said, I will put it up. And when he put it up, a local community radio station asked me to come on. And at that stage, I went on, and I think you said at the time, it was probably the first time excess deaths were spoken of on national radio, on any station.
That was a remarkable thing that Jimmy Rattigan stepped up there, because he was one in thousands.
Yeah.
He was like an old-fashioned journalist saying, this is a story.
Exactly. And I know Jimmy from a while back, but we wouldn't have been talking, in the meantime. And he didn't fall for it either. He thought that the vaccines were dangerous. And suddenly I came out of the woodwork, a local man, and he just jumped at it. And when the radio station asked me to go on, I said no first. I said, this is not about me. And I thought the whole thing, in inverted commas, I'd save the world. I had data showing Kilkenny, I think the deaths were up 30% or something like that. It was a small base to work off, and working off small figures can be misleading. But it was something, and the radio station knew it was something as well. So Jimmy said, you either shut up, or we know the old Irish phrase. He said, go in there and talk to them, and I did.
Before we go on, Patrick, I just want to say this, that if you think about this, this strikes me all the time about a story like this. You see, if what you were saying was wrong, it would be easily disposed of.
Yeah.
When they ignore you, it means you're right. And they know you're right, so they're not looking at what you're saying.
Well, what was very strange about that radio interview, I won't mention the name, the journalist, he rang me and he said, we'll have to record in advance. He had to get permission from the station. It's a community station. But he got the permission. And he was talking about the vaccines. I was not mentioning vaccines at this stage at all. I was just presenting figures saying there's something going on here. Now, what I believed was a different thing. But he was talking about the vaccines. And, I said I'm not going to mention them at all. But he brought him up, which was I was sitting there. I know it was recorded, but I remember when I went out on the station the following day, nothing was cut out of it. And that started all off. I think I contacted you not long after that.
Yes.
And that got the ball rolling. And then I just started, other people got in touch with me. I wasn't able to do the Irish figures. I hadn't the tech skills. But people got in touch with me, and a few months later...
The national figures.
Yeah.
Yes.
And they put them together. We put them together 2 or 3 different ways. We match up, we agree a figure, and we put it on the website, irelandexcessdebt.com.
And just remind me, the level of increase in excess debts. And I remember that this was the issue at the very beginning. I remember this being said, that we can't really say how serious the pandemic is until we see the excess debts, because that's the true measure of a pandemic.
Yeah.
And here you were saying, well, here they are now. Can we now discuss this? And they weren't interested.
Well, we didn't start putting them figures. I've originally put out figures, I think it was late 2022, and the national figures in 2023. But the point is, John, they would have known, because if the fella I know could scrape RIP.ie and come up with these figures, they could do it too. And what happens when you look at first of all, if you look at 2020, there was no excess debts. In 2019, I think the figure was 32,400, something like that. In 2020, it was 900 more. And that 900 more happened in April 2020, when our current Taoiseach, Simon Harris, initiated a policy of moving the elderly into nursing homes. And they dived through neglect, end-of-life protocols. And in April 2020, 1,000 extra people died.
Misuse of sedatives.
Yeah.
And also, I think, intubation or ventilators, which are lethal instruments to be used with somebody.
That probably didn't happen in the nursing homes, but that was happening anyway.
Yeah.
But the point is, 900 excess deaths in 2020 was all in 1 month. But the government used these figures to railroad through lockdowns and all sorts of craziness, and to prime people to get a vaccine. And that's what it was all about. Now, when you turn around in 2021, in the first 2 months of 2021, January, February, the vaccines were rolled out late December 2020, but in effect they started in January 21 in the nursing homes. The elderly, in inverted commas, were the lucky ones to get them first. And in those 2 months, there was 1,500 excess deaths, which was 25% up on the 5-year average. It was astonishing. Then there was a lull for the next few months. And then from the rest of the population was vaccinated. I think they tell us they reached 90% by July, August 2021. Between July and December 2021, there was 2,500 excess deaths, which was about 17% for those months. They're astonishing figures.
They are.
And they would have, I didn't know it when it was happening in 2021,
Yeah.
but they would have known.
Well, it's very important to stress here, isn't this correct? These kinds of statistics, death rates, suicide rates, all these, they're constant within societies, year on year, more or less. There'll be a variation of a few hundred here and there, plus or minus. But for example, the death rate for years in Ireland had been 30,000, 31,000, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And now it was going into the mid-30s.
It jumped. 2019, the 5 years to 2019 gave an average of about 32,500. And we jumped in 2021, it jumped to just under 36,000. In 2022, it was 37,000. This is from death notices. Now, official Ireland would have known these. They can analyse the figures as well as we can. The CSO figures don't come through until years afterwards. But even now, we were saying that there was 36,000 deaths in 2021 based on RIP.ie.
Yes.
The current CSO figures for 2021 are at 35,500, and they would still be rising because there's, unbelievably, there is still inquests and stuff, and you can't register a death until an inquest is over. So there's still deaths from 2021 and 2022 to come through.
Do you think you counted all the deaths? Or, I mean, the method you had was, as I understand it, that the language of the RIP.ie, for example, the use of suddenly, particularly for younger people, unexpectedly, these kind of concepts. How reliable would you say was that in terms of catching all of those categories of death?
I think you have to be honest about that. That was just a snapshot. I did that. I did that with Kilkenny, and it threw up astonishing figures. Again, they were off a low base. But what I did was, you would see in the notice, died unexpectedly or suddenly, and then you could go into the condolences, and you knew by the way people were talking that this was a sudden death as well. Now we all know there can be suicides and things like that. I took out when it was obvious it was a suicide, or it was obvious that it was a car crash or something like that. I took it out. It was only a snapshot, John. There's no, but it threw up astonishing figures. Like it looked like sudden deaths were up 100%, but again off small base.
Yes. To deal with the only responses that I've heard anywhere about the work you've done from the kind of people who seek to suppress this is the throwaway remark, oh well, the population is increasing and that's the reason for the excess deaths. What do you say to that?
Well, of course, in all obfuscation, there's always a bit of truth. And of course, the population is increasing, and the other one is the population is aging. Now, the population is aging, but it's not aging to the degree that you jump from 32,000, would say, deaths in 2020 to 36 in 2021. That doesn't happen. And we're at about 37,000 in 2022. So that just doesn't happen. Now, the other one with the rise in population. The population is rising. The Irish population isn't rising. The population of people living on this island is rising, and that's a different thing. It's rising because of immigration,
yes,
which has been channeled in, where the government are asking people in, and to dilute, to say these people, they're not 70-year-old Somalians coming in here to live. It's young people coming in to live. These aren't the people that are dying, even though the numbers of young people dying are up. And
they're correct as well, Patrick. Most of these people coming in haven't been vaccinated.
Well, that's true as well. So that's a red herring. The increase in population has nothing to do with it, because if the immigration didn't exist, our population is falling.
Yes, without
any doubt. I pointed out, I want to say, a friend of yours, in inverted commas, David Quinn, the commentator. I pointed him. I was in touch with him previously, and he ignored me, which is fair enough. But I pointed out to him the last CSO figures.
He's a normalisation man.
Yeah, I know. I realise his role, but I sent him figures showing that Irish deaths in the last quarter had exceeded Irish births.
Yes.
And he got back to me saying, no, we haven't reached that point yet. And I sent him the link, and I said, yes, we have,
I saw
David.
that.
And he went searching, and it was like a light bulb had exploded in his head.
Yes.
And he's all over it ever since. And
Well, I mean, all these stats are, and this is a slight diversion, but it's a very interesting point, that all of these stats, like for example, the natural increase is diminishing also, isn't it, over the years? When you look at the Irish population, there's like almost no natural increase nowadays, in most times. And as you say, in that particular quadrant, there was a minus figure. And this is the new pattern, isn't it?
Well, again, it's, John, what the CSO do is they release the figures, and they will tell you that the births are such a figure and the deaths are that figure, and there will be it looks like a natural increase. But when you dig into the figures, they break it down by nationality of mother. And when you look at the Irish births to Irish mothers and compare it, most deaths, 96, 78% of deaths must be Irish, real Irish. That's in inverted commas. I'm not trying to insult anyone by saying that. The point is, births from Irish mothers at this stage are lower than deaths, are very close. That's the point we reached.
RIP.ie then last year was purchased by my former newspaper, the Irish Crimes, as it's now known, or Slimes if you prefer. It's up to you. But what was the impact of that on Europe? Because I know that was quite a seismic shift in things.
Well, what that has done is basically, we've had to draw a line at the end of 2024. For people who don't know, the Irish Times bought RIP.ie. I just a quick thing of, like, there'll be 37 or 8,000, including foreign notices and duplications notices on RIP.ie. They're charging €100 a shot. Now, work that out, and you see the money they're making. And they're making the money on the deaths of people. And they've had a hand in a lot of what's gone on over the last few years. It's criminal isn't even a strong enough word for it. But the effect it's had on us putting figures together is, from they introduced the fee in January 2025, we cannot compare. It's very difficult to compare 2025 to the previous years, because we noticed straight away there was a fall. There was a fall in the numbers, definitely. Now, it could be because there's less people dying, and that's possible.
Yes.
Because at some stage, you have to reach the stage. If people are dying before their time, you have a thing called the pull forward effect, where unfortunately there's nobody left to die. And
yes,
at some stage, we haven't reached that yet. Now, it's possible we haven't reached it in 2025 because the amount of death notices are less. But we'll find out in time whether that's the truth of the matter.
Have you any sense of any effect that the €100 charge would have had? I mean, because these things are maybe absorbed in funeral expenses, which are pretty high anyway. So it's £100 in the midst of like several grand, you know, and it's not necessarily paid out by somebody who's paying their own money type of thing generally, you know, or very often. So I just wondered what kind of effect have you seen in the what appears in RIP.ie?
Definitely in the first January, February, March, there was less notices compared to previous years.
Right.
Now again, I do not know whether that's because people decided not to put them in RIP.ie or because there's less people dying.
Have you heard of news, say undertakers talking about that? Or?
No. I spoke to my local undertaker a couple of years ago, and he told me, as far as he was concerned, everybody put it in RIP.ie. Now that was in Kilkenny. But then a fella from Donegal who I got in touch with, and he was very cagey, he said he had he said at the time he had 8 funerals on the go, and 4 of them did not want to be in it. So maybe they're a different breed up the north. But I believe him, because the figures for Donegal for 2025, they're in, I think it's negative 20 or 30% excess deaths. So maybe they're at something different up there.
It's a different country. It always has been, really. It was always kind of cut off, really, from the rest of what was Ireland. So, like, what is your general sense now of the? Because I know that the material you produced in the last seems to show quite an alarming increase, even on the basis of that you'd already established with your figures. Isn't that right? Is it now still increasing?
I don't think it's still increasing. No.
No.
But I don't know. There's definitely less. But that.
Well, sorry, I meant sudden deaths.
Or sudden deaths. Well, the coroners every year. Coroners have to make an annual report of their closed cases, and they do a report chain. And basically, I summarise it for the country. I think there's 36 different coronial districts, and since 2020, sudden and unexplained deaths being reported to coroners are up about 30%. Now, that's the truth of the matter. It's in the figures, but the waters are muddied in a certain way, because in 2020, when the scamdemic was rolled out, there was an emergency law brought in that if someone died in a nursing home or anywhere, and the doctor said there was COVID in the building, or the person has COVID, the coroner was allowed sign off on that death, and it was registered without any post-mortem, without any need for an inquest post-mortem. And this increased. Every death like that had to be reported to the coroner. So the amount of the deaths reported did increase in 2020. But they're still high. They're still 30% higher now in 2022, 23, 24.
What has been your observation of coroners' findings and reports on all this? It's quite bizarre. I remember there was one particular coroner down this part of the country who seemed to be making noises in the very beginning, but he went underground pretty fast then.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about. I won't mention his name, but
yeah.
He put his head above the parapet. They're like, I think they're a bit like a bishop. In the past, they could say what they wanted as long as they didn't lose the run themselves. But he said a few things, and people thought he was, this is
the saviour has arrived. Yeah.
But he rolled back.
The conscience of the nation. Yeah.
But coroners are a law unto themselves. They just. To the strange, I contacted myself and Louise Grossway did these articles and researched them. We contacted nearly every coroner for a comment about these figures showing this massive increase, and we gave them the figures for their district, not just the Irish figures. And I think we got 4 responses. Now, I'll give you the one from Kilkenny, my own area. He got back to me, and he said first of all he acknowledged it. He said yes, he has seen it. And when we asked him, did he think he had a reason for it? He said, and again he's only talking about Kilkenny. He said, a lot of it is due to ultimately to heart issues that the people who were deceased were not aware they had, according to their families. Now that's the Kilkenny coroner.
And do these guys have any explanation for why this suddenly erupts in the middle of time and space, having never arisen before as a phenomenon, and now it's all over the place?
Well, you see, you got a crazy situation. We're all aware of the Ray Butler death. Like, Ray Butler died after I think it was the Janssen vaccine. He died within 5 days. He had symptoms, I think, within 15 minutes.
22 years of age, isn't that right?
He was 21. 21. He died in and he was a fit young man, healthy young man, playing soccer for his local club. And he died. He wanted to go out for a trip. So he went and got the vaccine. At this stage, you couldn't travel without it. And he died within 5 days. He had the symptoms within about 15 minutes. And he was dead. The inquest was deferred and put off. But finally, we got I think it was last October, the hearing was heard. And the coroner, it was held in Cork, the coroner said, that he couldn't find any connection between just because there was there was a temporal connection, but that meant nothing. So
that I remember that judgment, and it reminded me very much of a judgment that happened many years ago down in Tipperary in the Hanrahan case, where a family, the Hanrahans, found all kinds of things happening because of the Merck Sharp and Dome factory near their farm, and their cattle were dying and their neighbours were becoming ill and so on. And they took a case and they went through the entire system and got knocked back precisely on that basis, that no connection could be demonstrated between the factory and the events. Well, there's such a thing as circumstantial evidence, but this apparently is, no longer admissible. But in the end, in that case, a great judge called Seamus Henchy in the Supreme Court said that to actually say this, to say that there is no connection between these things, is to dethrone fact. And that's what those coroners were doing when they come up with this stuff. And this is something you can do. It's very similar to what happened in the case that myself and Gemma O'Doherty took, where you get this circular logic, whereby they say, well, there was a terrible pandemic and the government had to do and they didn't know and they had to do something, and in other words, get lost. We're not going to look at it.
The day before the Roy Butler result was given, there was another case in Dublin, a case of a man called Michael Laffin, very fit man, I think he was early 70s, who swam in the sea all his life. And I think it was in early 2022, he went swimming, his wife and children were on the beach, and he died. And they got him back to life, but he ultimately died in the hospital. And the inquest was held about this. And after he died, they swabbed him, and he had COVID. And the result of the inquest, according to, I can't remember her name. I should remember, because she's been involved in other strange stuff as well. But she said the man died of drowning caused by COVID. Now that was the inquest result, with complications from COVID. That's the craziness. And the next day, in Roy Butler inquest, he died within 5 days of taking the Janssen vaccine, and the judge couldn't make any connection.
Ultimately, Patrick, isn't this absolutely terrifying? That an entire culture, an entire country, not just an establishment, but all the branches, all the going out into the country, almost like without any dissent, can actually arrange among themselves, perhaps even without exchanging a sentence of instruction or whatever, to actually close down a question before it is even asked.
Well, I think we definitely saw this in January 23. Varadkar got up on the Dáil and acknowledged it, because the thing was out of control at that stage. Everyone knew, the dogs in the street were talking about it. He acknowledged in the Dáil the excess deaths. He said, I'm contacting the chief medical officer, I think it was Breda Smith at the time, and I'm looking for answers. We never heard another word. Stephen Donnelly, about 9 months later, was asked about this incident, wouldn't even acknowledge it happened. History is just, they're erasing, they will just look you in the eye and they would say, no, it didn't happen. And if we didn't have recordings of it, Varadkar standing there saying it, you'd wonder, are you losing your mind? And that's what they're doing to us. The simple truths are there. Whatever the exact figure was for excess deaths in 2021, don't have any doubt it only started in 2021. They're trying to fudge the figures. It started in 2021. You can come up with the reasons of why it's happening. That's up to you. But don't let anyone tell you it started earlier than that. It did not.
No, like 2020, to be absolutely clear, I mean, Denis Rancourt, the Canadian scientist, has done a really amazing work on this. And he shows this extraordinary pattern, not in every country, but in an awful lot of countries around the world, where the death rate is going along in the normal way through January, February into March. And then at the very end of March, it shoots upwards. And then it shoots back down again to the first week in May. In this spike, it's like an icicle upside down. And that is unique in all history, isn't that right?
Yes.
It's never happened before. Because why? It was actually an induced cull of population, of elderly population. And what actually happened in effect was that people who perhaps would have died later in the year, through the summer or in the autumn, died in April. And I suppose the consciences of the doctors who presided over that can be easily satiated by the fact that they would have died anyway, because that's the logic now, the new logic of the medical profession. Are you sure he was going to die anyway? You know, sure, what harm it was if he died in April rather than August? Sure, they both start with A, don't they? You know, so what's the difference? You know. Honestly, I mean, it's not a joke, it's not a laughing matter, but this is where we are. And this is like, I suppose, to before we bring in our next guest, like to say, like, in a certain sense, our purpose in this event is to sufficiently dismay you as you leave, so that in case you were not sufficiently dismayed when you came in, at the state of our country, the moral state of it, which is absolutely rancid, that really this is like something that up to 6 years ago, I, for one, could not have dreamed would ever happen. And now we're going to talk about something else that I didn't dream could happen with Jon Wedger, the great detective from the United Kingdom, who's been he worked for the Metropolitan Police, he worked for Scotland Yard, he's been investigating child abuse and sex abuse for many, many years. He's been speaking out very vociferously about it, very bravely about it in very recent times, taking on no less a person or no greater a person than the Mayor of London, and on his cover-up of grooming gangs and so on. Again, like what Patrick has been telling us about, it beggars belief what we are seeing in these stories and in these reports, that this is happening underneath subterranean level in our societies. And the media, the profession that I belonged to up to 10 years ago, I now shamefully have to say I was once a journalist. You know, I disown the profession. It is a criminal profession. So I'd like to introduce you, to broaden this out, to Jon Wedger. Thank you very much. Hello, John. How are you?
Thank you so much, John. Cheers.
It's nice to talk to you again, John. John and I did a conversation about a year ago. We talked on a video I did back then about this, and it's on there on Odyssey actually somewhere if you want to check it out. I'll also, but we'll be touching on pretty much the same issues, I suppose. Again, John, you were recently in the news, in the mainstream news actually.
I threw down the gauntlet to Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, and to the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. And I don't know, it was by default really that one of the national papers, I've been shouting about this for 20 years, 10 in the police, 10 outside, and all the main news agencies knew about me, but they decided to run with a narrative that it's the provincial towns in the UK with Kashmiri minicab drivers that are behind this. And my narrative is quite different, well, similar, kids get hurt in that same way, but the perpetrators vary. So they decided to sort of keep me in the dark. And it was only really when it started bubbling over and the fact that the mayor was on some sort of panel, and an MP called Susanne challenged him about the state of children in care and the abuse, the trafficking, I'm not endorsing the term, but child prostitution, we'll say it as it is, that was going on. And he just really sort of engaged in what I term as a seminar in semantics, and just played word games on national TV with an MP, and made a mockery of all those children that were at mortal risk, have been and will always be, when they're engaged in this level of criminality, prostitution. And it incensed me because I worked in that field for years, and I knew the dangers that existed, and I knew children that actually died from this lifestyle. And one of the major newspapers asked me my opinion, They did an interview with me, but I don't think they fully gauged my anger and my articulation on the matter. And the interview went out and it went viral. And then all of a sudden, all the major news agencies invited me on. And I put a challenge down and I said to Sadiq Khan and to Mark Rowley, the Commissioner of the Met Police, prove me wrong. There is not a person on this planet will prove me wrong that this crime does not exist. And what's happened is a U-turn has taken place. I called out to the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police because the Metropolitan Police had covered this up 15 years at least prior to my posting in Scotland Yard's Elite Vice Unit, with children as young as 9 years old to 14, that was the demographic I dealt with, all from the care system, were being pimped out. Most of them had Class A drug addictions, crack cocaine and heroin. I mean, can you just imagine a 9-year-old kid on crack cocaine? And they were being passed around for sex, and many had life-threatening injuries due to their lifestyle, such as AIDS, tuberculosis and hepatitis C. I mean, some of the illnesses were antiquated, but these kids, there was no protection for them. And they were passed around in crack houses, Jamaican yardies, these big, strong Jamaican men of violence who got away. They never had the finger pointed at once. They were by far the strongest sort of demographic of people that were doing this to them. You know, they were having sex with these young kids, 10 years old, some of them. Then the kids, they were swapped for drugs. The exchange was a kid would be brought into a crack house, passed around a crack house. Now, for anyone who has no idea what a crack house is, it's a derelict building or an old flat, something like that, on a housing estate where drug addicts go to purchase drugs illegally and take drugs. So they will inject heroin, they will gouge out, there's airborne diseases, there's blood-borne diseases everywhere. These are people really skid row or so. I'm not passing any judgment on them. Everyone's journey is different, and some people in bad luck end up in these places. And as many survivors of abuse end up on Class A drugs. You know, there was a study saying that 90% of heroin users have come from childhood sexual trauma. So, again, but these kids were passed around there, swapped for drugs. They were then taken to hotels, where hotels would set a room aside per hour. And builders, transient builders that come to London, back in the day it was mainly men from the north of England coming down for the building trade. Now, of course, it's East Europeans. And the kids were passed around there. And then they were dumped on the street and made to work the street, where sometimes the police would go by and just ignore it. And then the kids were taken to posh restaurants at night and exchanged for £2,000 a time.
Jon, you've been doing this in a long time. Could you just to kind of go into one aspect of it that I don't think often gets ventilated, but what, in your experience, is the effect on these children of this experience?
Right, so when we look at childhood trauma, sexual trauma, and this has been cited both in social services doctrines, both in the justice system and biblically, theologically as well. When a kid endures trauma, you damage the next 3 generations, right? So that is a long-term effect. The short-term effect, as people, we're made up of 3 parts. So you've got your intellectual self, you've got your physical self, and you've got your emotional self. So people that abuse can go on to achieve things intellectually, and some overachieve because there's a need to tell the world who they are. Physically, people can do very well. We saw a documentary recently about Falklands War with the role of the SAS. 5 SAS soldiers were interviewed, 3 had come from childhood sexual trauma. So physically, you can do well. But emotionally, I hate to say it, but you're screwed. Unless you get the therapy, your emotional clock stops. And you see it with people that have an inability to reason and rationale because it's the wounded child. And then that leads on to poor life choices. And that leads on sometimes to addiction, or many times addiction. But when we take the British penal system, 80% of men under age of 25 in our prison systems have come from childhood abuse. And then ultimately, what do we look at? children are a cash cow for the system. From cradle to grave, they will make money for the legal system. So the family courts, when people are fighting over the kids, to the juvenile courts, when the kids get in trouble because of the trauma, it's their little outlet. They don't like authority. Some kids don't achieve well in school because they have a thing called hypervigilance. So they're up all night because they're frightened, because night time is a dangerous time. And then that makes way to the magistrates' courts, where they're on their criminal career, and then that goes on to a serious and organised crime, because people don't trust an employer, they can't work for people, and there is another element, which if I get a chance I'll go into, the reason why survivors sometimes don't work for people, and it's a physiological thing, and it's not a nice thing to talk about, and then ultimately, from the coroner's courts, so the kids just make money from cradle to grave. And what happens ultimately here is a thing called suicide. How many people commit suicide have come from childhood trauma? So it is the single most detrimental and destructive thing to our society. Yet the police put crimes against children, if they can even be bothered to look at them, they're at the bottom of the pile. They just ignore it.
And why do you think it's that, John?
What we got to look at is a bigger picture. Look, the devil does things for more than one reason. When we get crime in general, I'm talking as a policeman here, right? 90% of a police officer's day-to-day duties is sort of running around on the uniform front of it, dashing from call to call, and you deal with disorder and dishonesty, usually on the lower working class housing areas, where there'll be 3 to 5 families, will cause chaos for everyone else. And there's all sorts of socio-economic reasons for that, but that really is a bread and butter of policing. Sex crime is different, because it's like a hot knife through the whole culture of society, right? People, the perpetrators of crimes against children, they come from the lower classes, the upper classes, the middle classes, and the ruling classes, because they're broken people. So I had a guy come to me, and his father was a well-known lord in the United Kingdom. And this guy had written a book. And he said to me, John, you talk about the kids from the care homes, from the housing estates that then get abused. He said, what about us, the kids from the ruling classes? We go through it as well. And I said, well, please tell me. And he told me a story, and it was appalling. His father would abuse him. He would rape the kid. He would then pass the kid out to his colleagues, who were 9 members of Winston Churchill's cabinet. So he was abused by 9 members of Winston Churchill's cabinet. He then went to a preparatory school, divested from his mother. His mother rejected him, didn't want to know him. So he was brought up by an abusive father. He went to this school at a very young age, where canings and buggery were commonplace. He then ended up in the dormitories of the elite Eton, the school that's produced 11 prime ministers. And he said they have a thing called the fagging system, where the older boys have governance for the younger children. And he said the fagging system is nothing more than a rent boy racket. When he reported his abusers for anally raping him, who were the older boys, and then they would also be in charge of discipline such as caning, he was taken before the dean, the don, whoever the governor of Eton was, who caned him that hard, his injuries were classed as if a hot wire had been lashed across his buttocks. He was then put under the pupillage of a Monsignor at Eton, who went on to rape him. So what chance did he have? So this is what it is. It's evasive. It's society's dirty little secret. And the reason they want to suppress it is once you lift that lid, you ain't never putting it back again. And I'm seeing this pattern because I went on and challenged Sadiq Khan and the Commissioner of Police. I know for a fact, because I called out and I said, survivors of abuse speak out, now's the time. And I said, whistleblowers, do not be frightened. The fear is for the children who have been abused, not for you. You've got shoulders stand out. And I know they've been inundated. I know, in my heart I know, not factually I know, that this stuff with Prince Andrew, or Andrew as he's now known, is as a result probably of special branch being inundated with survivors and victims speaking out. They can't contain this. This is going to grow and grow and grow. So what they're doing now is a thing called damage and limitation. They're doing their best to lick their wounds at the moment.
Listen to you, John, and having talked to you before, I mean, it was an eye-opener for me because, I mean, our society would tend to, most of us would tend to think that paedophilia is a kind of a rare peculiarity, you know, perversion that, you know, exists in dark corners. Your description, it's right happening in the mainstream of society with very powerful people, very wealthy people, as well as what you might call ordinary people. And it's not confined to any particular, I mean, I don't understand this entirely. I mean, the attraction to children seems almost not to be an issue, is it? It's not about sex in that sense.
No, it's not. I spoke to a profiler who works for the FBI who specialises in child murderers. And I said, I'm trying to get my head around the attraction a man has to a young, you know, infant boy. What is it? How is this even possible? Physiologically and also sexually and emotionally. And she said it's all about power and it's about control and it's about dominance. And we're dealing with people that are broken, that they are emotionally broken. And the one thing we got to understand is that years ago, especially in the political realm, if a politician was having extramarital affairs, it was shunned on, especially in the UK with the morals that the UK used to have. You know, you can't do this, can't do that. And someone could be bribed, you know, into coercion or silence or whatever it might be because they're having an affair. Now they're seen as a player. Then it was homosexuality. You know, people could be bribed into silence or coerced or duress into committing, I don't know, an act of malfeasance or whatever because they were homosexual. Now it's the opposite. Now there is this positivity, positive discrimination, all that sort of stuff. They can't get away with that. The last bastion of that is paedophilia. There is not a culture on this planet that allows it or endorses it. Put the Islamic stuff with Aisha and that to one side. They even did studies on remote indigenous cultures. And they went to Papua New Guinea and a little village at the basin of the Amazon. And they saw how they treated people who abused kids sexually. And they were banished from the village and they were sent into the jungle for a period of no less than 2 summers, which anyone on their own in these sort of rainforests would die. So it's basically giving them a death sentence. So no culture allows it. So it has coercive control. And it does control global politics. And it's a dangerous thing. So if anyone is involved in this, look at 11 prime ministers have come from Eton. I accosted, when I first started doing this campaigning, I did a lot with victims and survivors, and we used to campaign outside Parliament during Prime Minister's question times on a Wednesday. And I got hold of Boris Johnson, and I said, Boris, come on, please help us. These are survivors, I'm a whistleblower, this needs to stop. And he looked at me and he said, it's got F all to do with me, and just pushed past me. Theresa May hid so many files, and the worst offender of all was when the Home Secretary, that was Leon Britton. And many allegations came out against him during the independent inquiry. So and at the same time, our intelligence services, right, we had a guy called Sir Peter Heyman who was caught with child pornography, and when the police went round and raided his house and arrested him, he gave them £25,000 cash to shut their mouths, and they wouldn't take it. So it goes right to the top.
Is there a kind of an ambivalence? This is a difficult question and to tease out. Is there a kind of an ambivalence because of the fact that the abuser was once abused in almost all cases? Yeah. That in a certain sense there is a logic, and I've seen this in some academic work on this, that the idea that if somebody has resulted in this, having this condition, whatever it might be, this power thing, this that causes them to abuse, to re-abuse. The argument that is sometimes made is that what they need is to be, rather than punished, they need to be, we need a therapeutic approach to treating this condition. What do you feel about that?
Yeah, so studies have been done. So one active paedophile can create 112 victims within their life span, right? So out of the 112, 10% will go on to abuse, and that's the stats. So 10% that abused go on to abuse. So you get a higher propensity in that demographic than outside. And then, of course, they will then go on to create, them 10 will go on to create, 112, and so it goes. So when they've looked at an active paedophile in his lifestyle, with that knock-on pyramid effect, it can create about 2,000 victims. So it's colossal. So there is definitely a need for people that know what they're doing to get in there and stop it. So there is a program that is running where they can prevent 90% of dangerous sex offenders from reoffending. And one of the alarming statistics is that a paedophile on release from prison, on the whole, will reoffend within a month. So you need the right people in there. And I think it is prudent to have these people, these therapists there, because they will stop this, like I say, this pyramid effect from going. So as well as sanctions and imprisonment and protecting the public, as well as that, they need to start sorting them out in the prison.
Is that comprehensible, that dynamic? I can't say that I understand how a grown man, for example, can loom large over a little infant, a little child, and somehow get some sense of gratification that relieves them of a sense of powerlessness, which is what you're I think, saying.
Yeah, and also, it's a mafia. There was a big child care home scandal in the UK. It's called the Shirley Oaks care home in South London. And you've got to look at the history. I'll do a talk on this, on the history of child abuse in care homes, and it does shift. So during the 50s towards the 60s, there was a lot of women that worked in residential care homes that abused children, and the victims tended to be boys. And when women account for 10% of paedophiles, but when a woman abuses, it's done with a viciousness 6 times out of what a man can mete out. It's quite sadistic. And the victims and survivors of a woman paedophile, they've got a high percentage of reoffending in that category. But why did that happen in the 50s and 60s? And that was because a thing called war widows. There was a lot of women that lost a lot of men in their family, and they went on to have some sort of hatred towards men, and they got jobs in these residential homes because there was a lot of orphans, and they went on to do some terrible, terrible things. But the tide turned in the 70s throughout to the 80s and 90s of men abusing boys in care homes. And that came about because of discrimination laws. And there is a greater percentage of abuse in left-wing constituents than there are in right-wing constituencies. And that's because of the left-leaning down to fairness and discrimination. So what they found happened, and this came out of the independent inquiry, so this isn't some nonsense I made up, they found that they didn't want to discriminate against homosexual applicants. And in no way am I saying homosexuality and paedophilia are linked, I'm not saying that. But they didn't check, and there was a reluctance to check, and there was a ruling not to check the vetting of homosexual applicants that wanted jobs in residential care. So homosexual paedophiles would get in, and once one got in, they got another one in, and they found at one period of time there were 19 known convicted or sort of active paedophiles working in his care home, and by the end of the inquiry they found it had employed 119 dangerous sexual offenders.
I want to bring up Susanne Delaney, who's one of the organisers of the Mise Éire, and also has a profound interest in this particular subject and has been looking into it from an Irish point of view. So I think she's somewhere around. Let's see here. Hi, Susanne. Good to see you.
Hey, John.
She just, no, you stay where you are. I don't know if that works. Is it?
I can stand either. Thank you. See how that works. Can everybody hear me? Okay.
Hi, Susanne.
How you doing? How are you? How's everybody?
What is your view of what the things Jon is saying? Are you familiar with this in an Irish context as a phenomenon, or is it different, do you think?
I don't think it's much different. It's just we don't know as much about what's happening. It's happening really behind closed doors. And I think, one of the reasons why the state is trying to deflect from the little girl being raped in City West is because she's not the only one. This has been going on for a long time. There was a UCD study about predators targeting children in Ireland, and in that study they did mention Rotherham or Rochdale-style gangs, organised child sex trafficking going on. And this is happening, to girls who are in care, and there was actually one 12-year-old disabled boy as well. But when that story broke, some of you might be familiar with what I'm about to say, but when the story actually broke about that study, it was in the media very briefly, and then kind of the next day or the day after, they decided to break the story about Ryan Tubridy having 350 grand in his account that he shouldn't have had, some kind of COVID backhander, I guess, and it caused a scandal, and everybody was distracted then from what was happening to these children in care. I've been under the care of the state myself. I don't normally share such private information, but I feel like, I don't have the experience of Jon. I'm coming at things from a different point of view. But, and it's a long time since, I was under the care of the state. It was the Eastern Health Board then. A lot of you might remember that. So there's a lot of distraction around these girls being targeted in care. They're being taken from unregulated care facilities. I use that word very loosely, care, because TUSLA has spent 215 million on unregulated care for children. And what that means is anybody can really set up a business. They have, they might put children in Airbnbs, they might put children in apartments. The Ukrainian young lad who came over from Ukraine and 4 days later was stabbed over 100 times. We've no children in the room, by the way, have we? I don't want to be frightening anyone, but he was stabbed 100 times and had his eyes gouged out by a Somalian asylum seeker. I would have a question mark actually over that asylum seeker who committed that act, because the Ukrainian lad had no reason to lie about his age because they automatically have refugee status, but there's TUSLA are allowing, and it's happening, I'm sure Jon knows this, I don't know if he mentioned it, but I didn't hear everything that was said, but they're allowing men to come in and pose as children. Some of these men are in their 30s. I had a teacher contact me the year before last to say that he teaches 15-year-old girls and boys, and there's men in his class from Afghanistan who are, men who are in their late 20s, early 30s. And this has been going on since at least 2014. That's the first mention you can find in the media about this. And it's very easy to verify age, but they don't do that because that's against the rights of the asylum seekers. So that apartment that boy was murdered in is owned by Beg and Mirza Care, and it's Mohammed Beg and Farhan Mirza own this company, and they've received over 40 million from the state, a transference of taxpayers' money into the hands of these unregulated care providers. And what it means when they're unregulated is there's no, there's a lot of falsifying of background checks. There's been two separate companies involving African pastors who were previously, one of them actually previously was involved in a insurance fraud scam, and he still got a contract from the state to look after children in care. And it transpired that they were falsifying criminal background checks. And then another African pastor came out there last week. He was looking after children for Tusla, and it turned out he was falsifying criminal background checks. And the state then subsequently gave him a $6 million contract to look after our vulnerable elderly. So when you've got situations like, there was a 14-year-old girl who came unaccompanied to this country from Africa, and she ended up in care, and 1 hour later she disappeared from care, and a year later she was found in a brothel. So there's a lot of cover-up around all of this, and you've got to ask yourselves why that is. So one of the reasons why it was specified in the UCD report that the staff in these unregulated care facilities aren't reporting that there's girls being taken. You're talking very young children, like you know what John said, 9, 10 years of age. And I do believe that girl, that little girl who was raped in City West is one of those children, and I'll explain why I think that. But they're taking these girls out of these Airbnbs, apartments, where, by the way, they're with staff who have no background checks, and they're transferring them in taxis, drugged, you know, under the influence of alcohol, and they're bringing them to hotels where they're gang raped, and it's you know the same, like it's the situation that John is describing, and it's happening here. And unless we all speak up about it, like these kids have very little voice as it is. Kids by their very nature are vulnerable, but these kids in particular are extremely vulnerable. And I lose sleep at night thinking about what these children are going through, and nobody's really, only the people in this room may talk about it, but generally the country doesn't talk about it. So when that little girl was raped by the asylum seeker who should have been deported in March, you know, you've got to ask yourself, she was brought into town for a day trip. She was brought into the city centre for a day trip. She was in one of those apartments. And I have a 9-year-old daughter, and I can tell you she wouldn't know how to get a bus down the road, you know. So how does a 10-year-old child get from the city centre all the way out to City West, and specifically to an IPAS centre? And how does she get into the IPAS centre? Because I've tried to get into IPAS centres many times, and I have been aggressively blocked from doing so. So either, you know, maybe someone let her in and they didn't help her, and they took advantage and they raped her. I don't know. I'm speculating, but we have to speculate because we're not given the answers. And the state tried to then turn everything around onto the people who engaged in throwing projectiles at riot police. I've been at a number of these kinds of protests, and I can tell you the riot police always make the first move. Always. Myself and Stephen put together a couple of videos there about Coolock actually last year, where we got all the clips of them pepper spraying elderly, like an elderly, terminally ill woman who was sitting at a bus stop minding her own business, a little boy who was about 9 or 10, and some other elderly people. And of course, you know, they know there's always going to be the disenfranchised young lads who have had trouble with authority. They grow up in an area where they don't have the same opportunities perhaps as some people who grow up in affluent areas, and they know that they're going to engage in the violence, especially when they're seeing that, you know, they're targeting vulnerable people. So they got what they wanted in City West, and they tried to really deflect from what happened to that child. And as I say, the reason why they're deflecting is not just because she was raped. And they were talking about violence against the guards, but nowhere in the conversation did anyone mention the fact that rape is an act of supreme violence, regardless of whether there's hitting involved or anything like that. It's an act of supreme violence. And the only thing that should matter to anybody is what happened to that child.
Susanne, isn't it fair to say that if... Isn't it fair to say that as citizens, we have a right, in the face of what's happened here, to assume, until shown otherwise, that the authorities are up to their necks in this themselves, that they're actually doing this? We have a right to assume that until the onus of proof is on them to say, no, 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 this is what happened, not what you suggest. Because otherwise, we're... This child was in the care of the state. The state has a duty to explain how this happened. We don't have to speculate about it. We shouldn't have to speculate about it. And I think we can actually, until such time as they come up with a different answer and a different explanation, we can say, you are guilty of this.
Definitely, yeah. I asked a Virgin Media presenter and an RT presenter there last year, why don't they report on missing children? And the narrative in this country is humanitarian duty, and they weaponise people's empathy, and it's all about helping people, and it's not, because the kids who are going missing mostly are migrant children, so they don't want to talk about that. If they really cared about immigrants coming into the country, well, they'd want to talk about that. There's lots of unaccompanied children coming in. But when I asked them that question, then a couple of days later it appeared in RTE that I was a conspiracy theorist who believes that the state is involved in sex trafficking of children. But I actually didn't say that, they said that. So, that's very interesting to me that they said that. It's like they were telling the truth about what's going on, but trying to frame it in a way that this crazy lady is,
Yes.
so they're undermining and discrediting any hint of that in people's minds. They want that gone. And Ireland's no different to any other country. Of course you have politicians who are up to their neck in this kind of stuff. I'm going to bring up Roderick O'Gorman now, and I'm not saying he's involved in that, but I just want to make the point that he terminated the Child Law Project, which was the only public oversight into what's happening in the courts with Tusla. They documented everything that was happening, because there's dealings going on with Tusla that are, it's not just the child sex trafficking.
What I find astonishing about this is that for years and years and years, we heard an awful lot about clerical sex abuse, and the politicians of all hues were active on that, and rightly so. There's no quarrel with anything they had to say about that. Similarly, violence against women was always abhorred, and suddenly, for some reason, and we know what the reason is, violence against women isn't such a serious thing. And actually, paedophilia mightn't be such a serious thing at all. We don't have to get all head up about it. We shouldn't really be, throwing wild accusations around. That's the idea. That's the vibe we're getting back from our politicians, from our media, from the guards, from the judiciary, from everybody. And it's of a piece with what Patrick's talking about. It's in a similar kind of scenario where you have this appalling development in our culture, in our society, and suddenly it's not such a big deal. And Susanne is the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just that that it's not a problem anymore. It's that they will victim blame. Like that child, they said she absconded. Which you say that about a prisoner, and they said she had behavioural issues. So firstly, that was her private information that they gave out. Whether that's a legitimate assessment, no.
But Jon, listening to Suzanne's account, what is your interpretation of what's happening here?
Yeah, is this coming through?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah, it's the same over the other side of the RSC. What you're on about is a thing called supported living. Years ago, they would have kids' homes, which were these big industrial educational complexes, where they, like Bernardo's homes, where they put these kids. They've outsourced that, so it's all down to money. Everything comes down to money, even perversion comes down to money. So these homes have sprung up everywhere. So they filled the void from what the local authority didn't want to pay for. And you can actually buy these places. You can go and buy, like an old people's home, go and buy a Victorian house of 8 or 9 bedrooms and convert it into a kid's home, right? And they get £2,000 per week per kid. They have, on average, 5 kids. So you do the sums on that. That's big money. Now, these kids get put in there. They're vulnerable. They've been preyed on. Most of them have been abused in the home anyway. Mm-hmm. They're put in these places, and from day one, they're predated on. And also, what happens, and this is the sinister part of it, the pimps that pick up these young girls, they encourage these girls to get their friends involved in it. And this is what happens. Now, the other kids' homes were governed by, in the UK, a thing called Ofsted, which was the Ombudsman for Education. So they had to be a residential place, because the courts gave parental responsibility to these homes. So they had to make sure that all their educational and their welfare needs were sorted. These places are totally unregulated. And because these kids abscond, and they're not really sometimes the most flavourful kids to be around, they don't care. So a kid will go missing on hold, will go missing on a Thursday, will be picked up outside a kid's home. No one intervenes. I even went to these kids' homes and they gave me the number plates of cars that were picking them up. There were Albanian gangsters. One guy was picking up the girls and he'd only been in the UK a month and he'd already got this organised pimping racket with these brothels which go under the name of sauna and massage. They're not the brothels. And there's a lot of kids go in these places. And they're picked up, they're shipped off out, the kids are given drugs, introduced to that. In the whole world of criminality, they use them for a thing called county lines, moving drugs up and down the countries as well. Then they drop the kids back, usually on a Tuesday. They're suffering from the after effects of serious addiction and their lifestyle. They kick off for 2 days because they're rattling and they want their gear again. And then Thursday, it starts all over again. So the care home don't care, because they only have to put up with them for 2 nights and they're going to get their 40 grand a month. Right, the missing persons unit from the police, they have to deal with it, but they don't get out of the office, so they hand it over to the Child Protection Services, which are police. They don't want to deal with it because they said the kids involved in prostitution, it's not a family matter. So the police, if they have a vice unit, they don't want to deal with it because they say the kid's in care. So it just gets bounced around, and social services, they don't care, because the kid that used to be a problem and come to notice now has got what they think is a boyfriend and are going out and earning money. They're kept quiet because they're actively engaged in criminality. So social services wipe their hands of it, and these care homes don't give a toss because they're getting the money anyway. So, and it's awful.
So it strikes me, John. I mean, the story was quite shocking when it was that the police and other authorities were turning a blind eye to Pakistani grooming gangs because they didn't want to be racist. That was pretty appalling to begin with. But it looks like what's actually happening is far, far worse than that.
Yeah, the Pakistanis never invented this. This was well underway long before them. They're just the new kids on the block. And they have strongholds in these provincial towns because they've got a dominance. But if you go out in London, London is the 3rd biggest city in Europe, densely populated. It is the most diverse city in the world. The people that are pimping these kids out are as diverse as a population. And also, the one thing that we don't hear about are boys. In London, the ones I come across, boys as well as girls were being pimped out of every ethnicity and every religion. And I'm going to give you an example of how bad this gets. There was a young kid, he was 13 or 14 years old. He had been in the care system a long time and had been abused in one of these supported living places. No one had intervened. He was on the latter stages of AIDS. He was so sick that at times he had to be carried out of the care home to an awaiting car to be trafficked out to his abusers, right? And no one bothered to stop. That kid died. And that is just one of many. It's appalling, and they don't want to go there.
Susanne, what do you think could be done? Where do we need to start to open up this box for the public to look into?
Well, I do have I'm a little bit underprepared. I'm sorry. I don't know if you have time for me to read out.
Yeah, we have 10 minutes left. So yeah, if you want to read a page. Yeah,
so
sure.
I don't know if people will agree with what I have to say here, but this is my take on things. Can I just say before I read this though as well, it's not just Tusla, it's from the top down. Like there was a case here in Ireland in 2022 where a judge ordered a jury to acquit a man of 2 counts of rape, 1 count of sexual assault against a 6-year-old child because she did as he instructed her to do. So the judge said that she consented. So, and there's lots of other shocking things like that going on. So just the Irish Medical Council is funded by doctors, and they really kind of protect doctors. So, you know, in over 50% of cases where there's sexual misconduct or sexual assault against a patient, they don't inform the public because the doctor has a right to privacy. And there is currently a children's heart surgeon operating in this country who was found to be guilty of sexual misconduct in the course of his work. Now, he's a children's heart surgeon. So, you know, there's a lot of things like that going on. But if you have time for me to read my... I mean, this is not obviously what I'm going to say. It's not going to help some children. But I'm just talking overall in general about society, because all children are targeted by the state. And just one thing I just wanted to say about what Jon is talking about, and that systematic rape of children. We all always talk about being at war with the government, or the government's at war with us, and it's not a kinetic war. They don't need bombs, guns. They don't need to, destroy infrastructure to destroy the West. And but rape is a tool of war that's commonly used and against children and women. And I do believe that's, they're allowing this to happen, because they've got their agendas to fulfill. They want people to beg for the solutions. They make society as dangerous as possible. But I'll just read this if people don't mind.
Well, if you tell us, just take us through what you're saying, because
you can stop me at any time if you want to ask questions. But W.B. Yeats wrote a poem called "The Stolen Child," and I wanted to talk about the government stealing childhoods and why they do it. We have to advocate for children, and it's not just because they're vulnerable, but because if our children are not adequately assisted through the passage of childhood, the consequences of very maladjusted society. Children are the adults of tomorrow. Trauma doesn't exist in a vacuum, and it doesn't stay within the confines of your childhood. It follows you around for life. And it's proven trauma is actually laid down in your genes and is passed on to your children and their children and so on. So people who suffered through the famine, or as some of us might call it, a genocide, that trauma lives in us, and it's intergenerational trauma, and I believe a mass understanding of that would transform our existence. So much of what we're all experiencing right now could be avoided if we break the cycle or break the wheel and become an unbroken people. That's how we take back our country. There's a poet, Philip Larkin, and he wrote, it's a very short poem. I hope that people don't mind bad language, but he wrote, "They fuck you up, your mum and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn by fools in old-style hats and coats who half the time were soppy stern and half at one another's throats. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can and don't have any children yourself." Now, I don't agree you shouldn't have children. I agree quite the opposite, or I believe quite the opposite, but the poem encapsulates what I'm trying to convey in all but one aspect. It fails to address how establishments play an active role in causing and perpetuating trauma in various ways. Like, children are everything, and the government knows this, and that's why they target them. So I don't believe what the government does is passive, and it's done rather deliberately. Regardless of whether it's accidental or purposeful, the outcome is the same. And the government wants a psychologically unhealthy society, and they don't want children or people to be recognising when they're being manipulated. So, you know, attachment issues, a poor sense of self, poor boundaries, and a sense of demoralisation and other issues kind of lead to us becoming adults who are susceptible to control. And this produces people who struggle to think critically and are prone to, like, just, you know, outsourcing their thinking to the government, and then they're often lulled into a false state of, or like a state of suicidal empathy almost. So I just think that the way we get around that is that, sorry, just to say, there's an author, Bruno Bettelheim, and he wrote a book called The Uses of Enchantment, and he explained in that book how traditionally children's fairy tales served to warn children of real life dangers, like such as child abuse and manipulation, and these stories helped them solve existential problems such as separation anxiety, and The Children of Lear would be a good example of that because it's about parental loss and child abuse. But the books today, you know, you see what the kids are being targeted with at school, and you have to ask yourself why that is, because it's not good for them, it's not good for their development. So they don't want people being educated on how they're being abused. And the government is abusing us, and they target the children young because, as I say, then they grow up into adults that are easily controlled. And we have to kind of teach our children to understand like what you might call dark triad traits like Machiavellianism and psychopathy and narcissism. And we have to heal our own trauma as well, because then just as a society we just stand a better chance of telling the government to F off, really, which is all we all need to do, you know. So sorry it took so long there.
Thank you very much, Susanne. Thank you so much for your work on this and your contribution. And Jon, thank you so much. And I know it's been a very dark topic. I think it's important that we have talked about it. I think it's very important that the people of Ireland talked about it. And I look forward to the day when the Late Late Show will host Susanne and Jon and Patrick because the two issues that Patrick has spoken about and Jon has spoken, they are in their different ways the truth about Ireland, because the truth of our culture and of our country and of our government is to be measured not in, you know, the good news that they want to put out in press releases. It's got to be measured in the horrors that they don't want to talk about. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, John.